Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching the autumn leaves drift across the suburban Connecticut street. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light as she observed the house directly across from hers, where Sarah Mitchell had lived for 3 decades. The neighborhood knew Sarah's story well, or at least they thought they did. For 30 years, her husband David had been her devoted caregiver after a devastating car accident left her with severe injuries and cognitive impairments that required constant attention. The Mitchell house had always been quiet, its curtains drawn most days. David rarely socialized, dedicating every waking moment to Sarah's care. Nurses came and went, but David remained the constant presence, the faithful husband who sacrificed his own life for his wife's well-being. Margaret had always admired him from afar, seeing in his devotion something noble and rare in this modern world where commitments seem so easily broken. What Margaret didn't know was that her new security camera, installed just 2 weeks ago after a string of package thefts, had captured something extraordinary. The camera had a wide-angle view that included not just her porch, but also a clear shot of the Mitchells' living room window when their curtains were open. Last Tuesday evening, during a rare moment when David had forgotten to close them, the camera recorded something that would unravel 30 years of carefully constructed fiction. Margaret discovered the footage by accident while reviewing recordings, to catch the neighborhood cat that kept triggering her motion sensors. She almost scrolled past it, but something made her pause. There, in the Mitchells' living room, was Sarah, standing upright and moving with perfect coordination. She was laughing, animated, completely without the wheelchair or walker that had been her constant companions for 3 decades. And David was there too, embracing her, both of them moving freely in what appeared to be a normal, healthy relationship. Margaret's hands trembled as she rewound the footage, watching it again and again. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. Sarah wasn't disabled. Sarah had never been disabled, or at least not for a very long time. The woman who Margaret had seen wheeled to medical appointments, who had visiting nurses attending to her daily, who had become the neighborhood's symbol of tragic circumstances, was walking, talking, and living normally behind those closed curtains. The weight of this discovery pressed down on Margaret's chest like a physical force. She thought of all the fundraisers the neighborhood had organized, the meal trains, the donations to help with Sarah's care. She remembered the sympathetic looks everyone gave David, the way they praised his dedication. Everything had been a lie, but why would anyone maintain such an elaborate deception for 30 years? What could possibly be worth sacrificing a normal life, hiding away, pretending to be something you weren't? Margaret didn't sleep that night, the footage replaying endlessly in her mind. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling of her colonial-style home, listening to her husband Tom's steady breathing beside her. The October wind rattled the windows, matching the turbulence in her thoughts. Should she confront David and Sarah directly? Should she call the police? Was there some explanation she hadn't considered? Some medical condition that came and went, allowing Sarah brief periods of mobility? By dawn, Margaret had convinced herself that she needed more information before acting. She couldn't destroy someone's life based on one video clip, no matter how damning it appeared. Perhaps Sarah had experienced a miraculous recovery that they were still adjusting to. Perhaps the disability had always been intermittent, and the neighborhood had simply misunderstood the nature of her condition. Margaret needed to be certain before she said anything to anyone. That morning, Margaret positioned herself at her kitchen window with her coffee, watching the Mitchell house with new eyes. The routine played out as it always had. David emerged at 8:30 to collect the newspaper, waving briefly to neighbors passing by. The visiting nurse arrived at 9, staying for her usual 2-hour shift. Everything looked normal, perfectly choreographed, exactly as it had been for years. But now Margaret saw it differently, each familiar gesture potentially part of an elaborate performance. Around 11, after the nurse had left, Margaret made a decision. She crossed the street with a container of homemade muffins, her heart pounding with each step. She had been neighbors with the Mitchells for 15 years but had rarely been inside their home. David had always graciously accepted deliveries at the door, explaining that Sarah had good days and bad days, and they never knew when she might be up for visitors. It was a reasonable explanation that everyone had accepted without question. David answered on the third knock, his face showing surprise at seeing Margaret on his doorstep. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He had always been pleasant but distant, maintaining the careful boundaries of someone with heavy responsibilities. Margaret held out the muffins with a smile that felt false on her face, wondering if he could sense her nervous energy. If he somehow knew that she had seen what she shouldn't have seen. "Margaret, this is thoughtful of you," David said, accepting the container. "Sarah loves blueberry muffins. She's resting right now, but I'll make sure she gets one when she wakes up." His voice was warm, genuine, showing no sign of deception. Margaret found herself studying his face, looking for cracks in the facade, but found none. He was either an innocent man being wrongly suspected, or the most accomplished liar she had ever encountered, capable of maintaining his performance even in unexpected moments. Margaret returned home more confused than when she'd left, her mind churning with possibilities. She spent the afternoon researching medical conditions online, looking for anything that might explain what she'd witnessed. Could Sarah have a condition that caused intermittent paralysis? Were there disabilities that came and went unpredictably? The more she searched, the less likely any innocent explanation seemed. Most conditions that caused severe mobility issues were consistent, not episodic in the way that would allow someone to be wheelchair-bound one day and dancing in their living room the next. By evening, Margaret had made another decision. She needed to review all her security footage from the past 2 weeks. If Sarah's recovery was recent, there might be other moments captured on camera. She sat at her computer methodically going through hours of recordings, fast-forwarding through the mundane comings and goings of her quiet street. Most of the footage showed exactly what she expected: an empty street, occasional pedestrians, delivery trucks, and the familiar routines of suburban life. Then, at 2:15 in the morning on a night from the previous week, she found something. The Mitchells' front door opened and Sarah emerged, walking independently to the mailbox and back. No wheelchair, no walker, no assistance of any kind. She moved quickly, efficiently, like someone retrieving something they'd forgotten to collect during the day. Margaret's stomach tightened as she watched Sarah disappear back into the house, the whole episode lasting less than 3 minutes. It had happened during the hours when the neighborhood slept, when no one would be watching. Margaret saved the clip, adding it to the evidence that was accumulating on her computer. She now had to clear instances of Sarah moving freely, both captured when privacy should have been assured. The pattern suggested intentional deception, careful timing to avoid discovery. But the question that haunted Margaret wasn't just about the lie itself, but about its purpose. What did David and Sarah gain from this elaborate charade? Insurance fraud seemed the obvious answer, but could it really be worth 30 years of isolation, of pretending, of living a confined life when freedom was possible? That night, Margaret told Tom everything. They sat together on their back porch overlooking the garden Margaret had cultivated over their 25 years of marriage. Tom listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful in the dim light. He was a retired accountant, practical and level-headed, the perfect counterbalance to Margaret's more emotional nature. When she finished showing him the videos on her tablet, he was silent for a long moment, processing what he'd seen. "This changes everything about how we see them," Tom finally said, his voice careful and measured. "But Margaret, we need to think about what happens when this comes out. If they've been committing fraud, it's criminal. David could go to prison. Sarah too. Their lives will be completely destroyed, and everyone who helped them, who donated money or time, they'll feel betrayed. This isn't just about revealing a lie. This is about setting off a bomb in the middle of our neighborhood and watching the fallout affect everyone we know." Margaret spent the next 3 days in a state of paralysis. Unable to decide what to do with the information she possessed, she went through her daily routines mechanically, attending her book club on Tuesday and her volunteer shift at the library on Wednesday. But her mind was always across the street, wrestling with the moral weight of her discovery. She found herself avoiding the kitchen window, unable to bear watching David perform his caretaker role, knowing what she now knew about its fraudulent nature. On Thursday morning, everything changed again. Margaret was sorting through her mail when she heard a commotion outside. She rushed to the window to see an ambulance parked in front of the Mitchell house, its lights flashing urgently. Paramedics were wheeling Sarah out on a stretcher, David following close behind, his face ashen with worry. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, watching with concern as the woman they'd known only as the tragic invalid was loaded into the ambulance and rushed away. Margaret's first instinct was relief, thinking that perhaps Sarah had experienced a genuine medical emergency that would expose the truth without requiring her intervention. But as she watched David climb into the ambulance, his distress so palpable it seemed to radiate from his body, she felt something unexpected: doubt. His fear looked real, his anguish genuine. Could someone maintain such a perfect performance even in a crisis? Or was there something more complicated happening here than simple fraud? The neighborhood buzzed with speculation throughout the day. Margaret learned from Linda Chen, who lived 3 houses down, that Sarah had collapsed that morning and David had found her unresponsive. The hospital was running tests, but no one knew anything definite. Margaret found herself at her computer again, staring at the saved videos, trying to reconcile the walking, laughing Sarah with the woman who was now in a hospital emergency room, possibly fighting for her life. That evening, David returned home alone, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Margaret watched from her darkened living room as he entered his house, and for a moment she saw him pause in his doorway, looking out at the neighborhood with an expression of such profound weariness that it made her chest ache. Whatever was happening in the Mitchell house, whatever lies had been told or truths concealed, there was real human pain involved, pain that transcended questions of right and wrong. Margaret made a decision in that moment, though it went against every instinct that had been screaming at her for days. She would wait. Before she revealed what she knew, before she destroyed lives and relationships and the careful fabric of trust that held their neighborhood together, she would try to understand. She would try to learn why two people would choose to live such a constrained, isolated existence when they didn't have to. Because somewhere in those 30 years of deception, there had to be a reason. A story that explained how good people, or people who had once been good, could commit to such an elaborate and sustained lie. Sarah remained in the hospital for 3 days, during which the neighborhood organized in the way communities do during crisis. Meal trains were arranged, offers of help flooded in, and Margaret found herself reluctantly participating, bringing a casserole to David's door on Saturday evening. He accepted it with gratitude that seemed genuine, though his eyes held a distance that hadn't been there before, as if the emergency had stripped away some protective layer he'd maintained for years. "They're not sure what caused it," David told Margaret as she stood on his porch, the October evening growing cool around them. "The doctors are running tests, but Sarah's stable now. They think it might have been a reaction to her medications or maybe a small stroke. With her condition, everything's complicated." He delivered these lines smoothly, with the practiced ease of someone who had told similar stories countless times. But Margaret noticed something new in his voice. A weariness, a hint of something that might have been surrender. Margaret nodded sympathetically, playing her part in their mutual performance. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you, David. 30 years of caregiving and you've never wavered in your dedication. You're an inspiration to all of us." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, layered with meanings he couldn't perceive. She watched his face carefully, looking for any crack in his composure, any sign that he sensed her knowledge. But he simply thanked her, his mask firmly in place. That night, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the way David had said her condition, those 2 words that had become the umbrella, under which 30 years of deception had sheltered. She realized that in all the years she'd known the Mitchells, she'd never heard anyone specify exactly what Sarah's condition was. It was always vague, always implied rather than stated. The accident, the injuries, the ongoing care needs, the neighborhood had filled in the details themselves, making assumptions based on wheelchairs and nurses and closed curtains, never demanding the specifics that might have revealed inconsistencies. On Monday, Sarah came home from the hospital. Margaret watched from her window as David helped her from the car, carefully supporting her as she moved slowly toward the house in her wheelchair. The performance resumed seamlessly, each gesture calibrated to communicate fragility and dependence. But now Margaret noticed things she'd never seen before. The way Sarah's hands gripped the wheelchair arms with strength that seemed inconsistent with someone who couldn't walk. The brief moment when her legs appeared to take her own weight before David adjusted his support. The flicker of awareness in her eyes as she scanned the gathering neighbors before arranging her face into an expression of weak gratitude. Margaret realized in that moment that she was seeing Sarah Mitchell for the first time, truly seeing her. Not as the tragic figure the neighborhood had constructed, not as the disabled woman who existed in their collective imagination, but as a real person making conscious choices about how to present herself to the world. And with that realization came a new question. What must it be like to live your entire life as a performance? To never show your true self to anyone outside your house? To be simultaneously invisible and the center of everyone's sympathetic attention? What would drive someone to choose that existence? The following week, Margaret made a choice that surprised even herself. Instead of confronting David and Sarah, instead of going to the police or sharing the videos with neighbors, she decided to do something that felt simultaneously risky and necessary. She would try to befriend them, not as the distant neighbor offering occasional casseroles, but as someone who might eventually be trusted with the truth. She told herself this was about gathering more information, about being absolutely certain before she acted, but part of her knew it was something else. She was curious about these people who had maintained such a massive deception for so long. She wanted to understand them. Margaret began slowly increasing the frequency of her visits. She brought meals twice a week, timed her gardening to coincide with David's outdoor chores so they could chat over the fence, and volunteered to pick up prescriptions when she mentioned she was going to the pharmacy anyway. David accepted these gestures with polite gratitude, maintaining his careful boundaries. But Margaret was patient. She had learned patience in her 50 years, particularly in the 15 years she'd spent working with troubled teenagers at the community center before her retirement. She knew how to make people feel safe, how to create space for truth to emerge. By the third week of her subtle campaign, she noticed a shift. David began to linger during their conversations, sharing small details about his life that went beyond the standard updates on Sarah's condition. He mentioned that he'd once wanted to be a marine biologist, that he'd studied oceanography in college before life took him in different directions. He talked about his parents, long deceased, and about growing up in coastal Maine, where the ocean had been his constant companion. These personal revelations were tiny, almost insignificant. But to Margaret, they represented cracks in the wall David had built around himself. Sarah remained elusive, though Margaret caught glimpses of her through windows, always positioned in ways that suggested limitation and need. Once, Margaret insisted on bringing the meal directly to Sarah instead of leaving it with David, and he had reluctantly agreed. Sarah was in the living room, arranged in her wheelchair with a blanket over her legs, the television playing softly. She greeted Margaret with a warm but weak voice, thanking her for the kindness with words that felt rehearsed, performed. Her eyes, though, were sharp and assessing, studying Margaret with an intensity that suggested keen intelligence behind the facade of confusion and limitation. "You've been so good to us," Sarah said, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to pat Margaret's arm. "David tells me you've been visiting more often. It means so much to have neighbors who care." The tremor in her hand looked genuine, but Margaret found herself wondering if it was real or another layer of the performance. She was learning that once you knew someone was capable of sustained deception, every gesture became suspect, every word potentially calculated. It was exhausting, this constant evaluation of authenticity, and it gave her a glimpse into what Sarah's life must be like. Always performing, never able to relax into genuine expression. That evening, Margaret sat with Tom on their porch again, the November air crisp with the promise of winter. She told him about her strategy, about her growing relationship with the Mitchells, and about the strange mixture of fascination and revulsion she felt watching their performance up close. Tom listened, then asked the question that Margaret had been avoiding. "What are you going to do when you finally know the truth? Because you will eventually. If you keep pushing at this, they'll either trust you enough to confess, or they'll make a mistake that confirms everything. And then you'll have to decide whether knowing the reason makes the lie forgivable." December arrived with unexpected warmth. A false spring that had the neighborhood confused about whether to enjoy the mild weather or worry about climate change, disrupting the seasons. Margaret continued her patient cultivation of the Mitchells' trust, and slowly, incrementally, she felt David's defenses lowering. He began to invite her in for coffee when she visited, and these conversations stretched longer, touching on topics beyond the immediate concerns of Sarah's care and neighborhood news. They discussed books, politics, the state of the world, the small disappointments and unexpected joys of growing older. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in the Mitchells' kitchen drinking coffee, David said something that made her heart race. "You know, Margaret, you remind me of who Sarah used to be before the accident." She was vibrant, engaged with everything around her, always wanting to understand people. He said it wistfully, looking out the window at the unseasonably warm day, and for a moment, Margaret saw genuine grief in his expression. Either he was the most accomplished actor she'd ever encountered, or some part of his story, some essential element of loss, was real. "Tell me about her," Margaret said carefully, sensing an opening about who she was before. "You've been caring for her for so long, but I realize I don't really know much about Sarah beyond her current situation." She watched David's face as he considered her request, seeing him weigh what to reveal, how much truth to allow into the open air. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and danger, and Margaret held her breath, wondering if this would be when everything changed. David stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a photo album that looked worn with age. He brought it back to the table, opening it to reveal pictures of a young couple, vibrant and smiling, frozen in moments of joy from decades ago. "This is Sarah at 25, he said, pointing to a photo of a beautiful woman with long dark hair and bright, intelligent eyes. She was finishing her graduate degree in psychology, working at a clinic for trauma survivors. She wanted to help people heal from the worst things that had happened to them. She believed people could change, could recover from anything if they had the right support." Margaret studied the photos, seeing not just the young couple they had been, but also what they had become. In one image, Sarah and David stood on a beach, the ocean stretching behind them, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of complete happiness and hope. The contrast with their present lives was stark, almost unbearable. Whatever had happened to transform them from these carefree young people into the isolated, secretive couple they were now, it had been profound and devastating. Margaret felt her certainty wavering, her judgment becoming less clear as she glimpsed the people they had once been. "The accident changed everything," David continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. One moment we had our whole lives ahead of us, all these plans and dreams, and the next moment, everything was just gone, shattered. We tried to hold on to who we'd been, but eventually you realize that person doesn't exist anymore. You have to become someone new, someone you never wanted to be, and you have to find a way to live with that. His words carried the weight of genuine pain, and Margaret found herself reaching across the table to touch his hand, offering comfort even as she wrestled with her knowledge of his deception. That night, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd glimpsed something important. Some key to understanding the mystery that consumed her thoughts. David's grief seemed real, his loss genuine, even if the physical disability that supposedly caused it was fabricated. What if the lie wasn't about insurance fraud or financial gain? What if it was about something else entirely? Something more complicated than simple deception? She pulled up the videos on her computer again, watching them with new eyes, trying to see past the obvious fraud to whatever deeper truth might be hidden beneath it. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a neighborhood holiday party in mid-December, Margaret had convinced David to attend, promising that Sarah would be fine with the nurse for a few hours, that he deserved a break from his constant caregiving. He had resisted initially, but eventually agreed. Appearing at the party looking uncomfortable in social settings he'd avoided for years, Margaret watched him navigate conversations with neighbors, saw how he fielded their questions about Sarah with practiced ease, deflecting inquiries with concern for his wife and gratitude for their support. But later in the evening, after several glasses of wine, David's control slipped. He found Margaret on the host's back deck, looking out at the lights decorating the surrounding houses. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice slightly slurred, his usual careful boundaries blurred by alcohol and perhaps by exhaustion at maintaining his secret for so long. "Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if we'd made different choices, if we'd been braver or more honest, or just willing to face things we were afraid of facing." Margaret turned to him, her heart pounding, sensing that she was finally approaching the truth. "It's never too late to make different choices, David," she said gently. "Whatever happened, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone forever." She watched his face carefully, seeing the war between his desire to confess and his commitment to the lie that had shaped 3 decades of his life. He swayed slightly, and she wondered if he would speak, if the wine would finally break through the wall he'd built so carefully. "You don't understand," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "Some choices, once you make them, they define everything that comes after. They become who you are. Sarah and I, we made a choice 30 years ago, and we've been living with it every day since. We've been prisoners of it, really, even though we built the prison ourselves. And now, even if we wanted to be free, I'm not sure we know how. I'm not sure we deserve to be free." He looked at her with eyes full of pain and confusion, a man drowning in the consequences of decisions made long ago. Before Margaret could respond, before she could push him to explain what he meant, Tom appeared on the deck, informing them that Sarah's nurse had called. There was no emergency, but the nurse was asking when David would be home. The moment was broken, and David seemed to pull himself together, the mask sliding back into place as he thanked Margaret for encouraging him to come and made his excuses to leave. Margaret watched him go, frustration and sympathy warring within her. She'd been so close to understanding, so close to hearing the truth from his own lips. That night, Margaret told Tom about the conversation, about David's cryptic confession that seemed to acknowledge some kind of wrong while still withholding the specific details. "He said they made a choice 30 years ago," she explained, pacing their bedroom while Tom prepared for bed. "Not that there was an accident, not that Sarah was injured. He said they made a choice. What if the accident was real, but Sarah recovered? What if they decided to maintain the fiction of her disability for some reason, and then it just became their life? What could possibly make that worth it?" Tom stopped what he was doing and looked at his wife with serious eyes. "Margaret, I think you need to consider the possibility that whatever reason they had, it might not be something you want to know. Sometimes people do terrible things for what they believe are good reasons. Sometimes people make choices that protect them from things worse than the lies they're living. If you keep pushing at this, if you force them to reveal whatever they're hiding, you might be opening a door that can't be closed. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to be responsible for whatever happens when the truth comes out?" Christmas week brought snow, finally, transforming the Connecticut neighborhood into a postcard scene of winter beauty. Margaret found herself at the Mitchells' door on Christmas Eve, with a plate of cookies, ostensibly to wish them happy holidays, but really hoping for another opportunity to reach David, to break through to whatever truth was hovering just beyond her grasp. She had spent the weeks since the party analyzing every word of their conversation, every nuance of David's near confession, trying to piece together the puzzle with insufficient information. David answered the door looking haggard, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. "Margaret, thank you. "Come in, please. It's too cold to stand out there." His invitation was more urgent than usual, almost desperate, and Margaret followed him inside with growing concern. The house felt different somehow, charged with tension that hadn't been there before. Sarah was in the living room, positioned in her wheelchair as always, but something in her posture suggested alertness rather than limitation, readiness rather than fragility. "We need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice stronger than Margaret had ever heard it. "David tells me you've been kind to us, more than just neighborly. He says you've been trying to understand us, to see beyond what everyone else sees. That's rare, and it's dangerous for us, but maybe it's also an opportunity." She gestured to the sofa across from her wheelchair. "Sit down, please. It's time someone knew the truth, and maybe you're the person who should know. Maybe we're all tired of lying, or maybe we're just tired in general. Either way, the choice to tell you feels less difficult than the choice to keep hiding." Margaret sat, her heart racing, finally at the threshold of the revelation she'd been pursuing for months. David moved to stand beside Sarah's wheelchair, and they looked at each other in a way that communicated volumes, a whole conversation happening in glances and subtle nods. Whatever they were about to reveal, they'd discussed it, agreed to it together. The unified front they presented was both impressive and unsettling, a reminder that despite everything, they were partners in this, complicit together in whatever truth they were finally ready to share. "There was an accident," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. 30 years ago, exactly as everyone knows. I was injured badly, spent months in the hospital, underwent multiple surgeries, faced a long and uncertain recovery. The doctors weren't sure I'd walk again, weren't sure about a lot of things. And during those months while I was broken and David was terrified of losing me, something else happened. Something we didn't plan, didn't want, but couldn't escape once we knew about it." David picked up the narrative, his voice tight with old grief. "I had been drinking the night of the accident. I was the one driving. Sarah was hurt because of my choices, my carelessness, my criminal negligence. I should have been charged, should have gone to prison, but the police investigation was incomplete. No one tested my blood alcohol level at the scene because I wasn't injured. And by the time anyone thought to question whether I'd been drinking, enough time had passed that there was no way to prove it. I got away with it legally, but Sarah and I both knew the truth. She was suffering because of what I'd done." Margaret felt the pieces beginning to click into place, the outline of their secret taking shape in her mind. "So you decided that you should suffer too," she said softly, "that you should dedicate your life to her care as penance for what you've done? But why fake the extent of her disability? Why not just care for her during her actual recovery?" Even as she asked, though, she suspected she knew the answer, could see the twisted logic that had trapped them in 3 decades of deception. Sarah wheeled herself closer to Margaret, and in the movement, Margaret could see the practiced limitation, the way Sarah controlled her strength to appear weaker than she was. "I recovered," Sarah said simply. "Faster than anyone expected. More completely than the doctors predicted. Within 2 years, I was walking again, functioning normally, capable of resuming my life. But by then, David and I had built something else. A prison of guilt and penance, of punishment and atonement. We had told everyone, including our families, about the extent of my disabilities, about how I would need lifelong care. We had accepted their sympathy, their money, their help, and we had built our entire identity around this narrative of sacrifice and devotion." David sat down heavily in a nearby chair, his face a mask of exhausted relief at finally telling their story. "At first, we told ourselves it was temporary, that we'd gradually phase out the deception as Sarah's recovery became obvious. But months turned into years, and we were in too deep. People had donated money for my caregiving. Insurance had paid out claims based on the permanence of Sarah's condition. Our families had restructured their lives around supporting us. If we suddenly revealed that Sarah was fine, that she'd been fine for years, what would that make us? Frauds, criminals, people who had exploited everyone's goodness for our own twisted purposes? But what were your purposes?" Margaret asked, still struggling to understand. "What did you gain from this? You've spent 30 years trapped in your house, isolated from normal life, pretending to be something you're not. Why not just come clean, face the consequences, and reclaim your freedom?" She looked between them, seeing 2 people who had somehow convinced themselves that their self-imposed prison was preferable to the judgment they'd face if the truth emerged. Sarah and David exchanged another of their meaningful glances, and Margaret realized there was still more to the story. Another layer of truth they hadn't yet revealed. "There's something else," Sarah finally said. "Something we've never told anyone. Something that explains why we've stayed in this situation, even when the weight of it became almost unbearable. About 5 years into our deception, we discovered that my sister had been embezzling from the family business. The business my parents had built, and that should have been my inheritance. She'd been doing it for years, and she'd taken hundreds of thousands of dollars. David continued where Sarah left off, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. We found out by accident, came across records she'd left at Sarah's parents' house during a holiday visit. We confronted her and she broke down, confessed everything. She was desperate, drowning in gambling debts, about to lose her house. She begged us not to tell our parents, who were elderly and whose hearts would have been broken by what she'd done. So we made a deal. We would keep her secret if she would keep ours. Margaret felt the full complexity of their situation washing over her. Understanding finally why they'd remained trapped for so long. She knows you've been faking Sarah's disability, Margaret said, and both of them nodded. So you're locked in mutual assured destruction. If either of you talks, both of your lives implode. Her crime becomes public. She goes to prison, your parents' legacy is destroyed. Your fraud becomes public, you face legal consequences, everyone who helped you feels betrayed. You're prisoners of each other's secrets. Exactly, Sarah said, and Margaret heard exhaustion in that single word. The weariness of carrying an unbearable weight for too long. And now Sarah's parents are gone, have been for 3 years. The business is sold, the money dispersed. The original reason for our silence no longer exists, but the habit of hiding, the fear of exposure, the knowledge of all the ways our truth would hurt people we care about, all of that remains. We've been trying to figure out how to escape this for years, but every path forward seems to lead to destruction. For us and for others, Margaret sat in the Mitchells' living room long into Christmas Eve night, listening as they unraveled 30 years of secrets, explanations, and justifications. They told her about the first time Sarah had walked after her recovery, how they'd cried together with relief and joy before the weight of their deception crashed down on them. They described the elaborate systems they'd developed to maintain the fiction, the careful timing of her mobility, the genuine nurses who came to care for a woman who didn't need care but who submitted to it as part of her performance. They explained how Sarah's sister Jennifer had gradually paid back most of what she'd stolen, how she'd gotten help for her gambling addiction and rebuilt her life. But the knowledge of each other's secrets had created a bond of mutual fear that none of them knew how to break. She calls us every few months, David said, just to check in, she says. But we all know what it really is. She's reminding us that she knows, and we're reminding her that we know. It's a deadlock that's poisoned all our relationships, turned us all into people we never wanted to be. Margaret asked the question that had been haunting her since she'd first seen the video. But why continue now? Your parents are gone, Sarah. Your sister has paid back the money. The insurance claims are old enough that prosecuting them would be difficult. You could come forward, face whatever consequences remain, and finally be free. What's stopping you at this point except fear and habit? She watched their faces as she spoke, seeing the mixture of hope and terror her words provoked. Because we don't know who we are anymore without this, Sarah said, and her voice cracked with emotion. For 30 years I've been the disabled woman. That's my identity. My entire sense of self. David has been my devoted caregiver, the man who sacrificed everything for love. Those identities, even though they're built on lies, they're all we have. If we give them up, who are we? Just 2 people who made terrible choices and wasted their lives. 2 people who hurt everyone who cared about them. How do we face that? How do we look in the mirror and accept what we've become? David moved to kneel beside Sarah's wheelchair, taking her hand. We've talked about telling the truth so many times. We've written confession letters we've never sent. We've rehearsed what we'd say to our families, our neighbors, the authorities. But every time we get close to actually doing it, the fear overwhelms us. Not just fear of legal consequences or social judgment, but fear of having to truly see ourselves. Without the elaborate justifications we've built, without the narrative of penance and sacrifice, that's let us live with our choices. Margaret felt something shift inside her as she watched them, these 2 broken people who had trapped themselves in a prison of their own making. Her initial anger at their fraud, her sense of betrayal on behalf of all the people they'd deceived, hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. Compassion for the impossible situation they'd created. Understanding of how small choices and desperate circumstances could snowball into decades of deception. She realized that in pursuing their truth, she'd been seeking simple answers, clear categories of right and wrong. Instead, she'd found only complicated human beings trying to survive the consequences of their mistakes. What do you want from me? Margaret finally asked. Why tell me all this now? What are you hoping I'll do with this information? She looked between them, seeing the plea in their eyes, the desperate hope that she might somehow offer a way out of the maze they'd built around themselves. But Margaret wasn't sure she had any answers, wasn't sure there were any good solutions to a problem this deeply entrenched in decades of deception and mutual destruction. Sarah wheeled herself to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, the Christmas lights twinkling in the darkness. We're telling you because you already know, she said. David realized it weeks ago, saw the way you watched us, the questions you asked, the careful way you were trying to understand rather than simply judge. We figured you had some kind of evidence, something you'd seen or discovered, and we decided that maybe, instead of waiting for you to expose us, we could tell you ourselves, give you the full story, hope that understanding might lead to something other than immediate destruction. The security camera, Margaret said, and both David and Sarah turned to look at her. I have videos of you walking, Sarah, multiple instances of you moving freely when you thought no one was watching. That's how I knew. That's what started me investigating, trying to understand what I was seeing. She pulled out her phone, showing them the clips she'd saved. They watched in silence, seeing themselves through her camera's eye, their secrets made visible and undeniable. David laughed, a bitter sound without humor. So it's finally happened. After 30 years of being so careful of maintaining every detail of our performance, we're undone by modern technology. A neighbor's security camera catching what we thought were private moments? There's a certain justice in that, I suppose. We've been living in fear of exposure for so long, and now it's finally here. He looked at Margaret with eyes that held resignation rather than fear. So what happens now? Do you go to the police? Tell the neighbors? We'll understand whichever you choose. In some ways, it might even be a relief. Margaret considered her options, the moral weight of her knowledge pressing down on her. She could destroy them with a few phone calls, could set in motion consequences that would unravel 30 years of lies and hurt countless people who had believed in the Mitchells' story. She could remain silent, become complicit in their fraud, carry the burden of their secret alongside them. Or she could try to find some third path, some way of moving toward truth that didn't require complete destruction. But what would that look like? How do you unwind 30 years of deception without causing devastation? I'm not going to do anything immediately, Margaret said slowly, watching their faces for reaction. But I need you to understand something. This can't continue indefinitely. You can't live the rest of your lives trapped in this lie. And I can't carry this secret forever without feeling like I'm enabling something wrong. We have time, maybe a few months, to figure out a way forward that does the least damage possible. But there has to be a way forward. The status quo isn't sustainable anymore. Not now that someone outside your circle knows the truth. Sarah and David looked at each other, and Margaret saw something pass between them. Some communication in that glance that she couldn't quite interpret. What if we told you there might be another option? Sarah asked carefully. Something we've been researching but were afraid to pursue alone. What if there was a way to come clean that didn't result in criminal charges, that allowed us to make restitution for what we've taken while avoiding prosecution? We've been looking into truth and reconciliation processes, into ways of acknowledging wrongdoing that focus on repair rather than punishment. David pulled out a folder from a drawer, handing it to Margaret. Inside were articles about restorative justice programs, information about how some communities were handling fraud cases through mediation and restitution rather than through the criminal justice system. We've been thinking about approaching the people we've harmed, the insurance companies, our families, and offering to make things right, to pay back what we took, to explain what happened, to submit to whatever consequences they feel are appropriate. It wouldn't erase what we've done, but it might provide a path out of this that doesn't destroy every life it touches. Margaret flipped through the materials, her mind racing with possibilities. This would require incredible courage, she said. It would mean facing everyone you've lied to, accepting their anger and disappointment, living with the judgment and gossip that would inevitably follow. It would mean giving up the identities you've built, the protection your lie has provided, the sympathy you've received. Are you really prepared for that? Because once you start down this road, there's no going back to the safety of your secret. She looked at them. These two people who had been strangers just months ago, searching for signs of the strength they'd need to see this through. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the snow sparkling under bright sunlight. Margaret sat at her kitchen window drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood come alive with holiday celebrations. Children emerged onto lawns to test new sleds. Families loaded into cars to visit relatives. And the Mitchell house sat quiet across the street, curtains drawn as always. But now Margaret looked at that house with different eyes, seeing not just the facade of tragedy and sacrifice, but the complicated human reality behind it, the prison of secrets and the desperate people trapped inside. Tom joined her at the window, placing his hand on her shoulder. You've been up for hours, he observed, thinking about what they told you. Margaret nodded, leaning into her husband's comforting presence. They had been married for 25 years, and in that time they'd faced challenges and made mistakes, but they'd always faced them honestly together. She couldn't imagine living the way David and Sarah had, maintaining a lie of such magnitude for so long. The constant vigilance it must require, the isolation it must create. "I've been thinking about what truth costs," Margaret said, "and what lies cost. The Mitchells have paid for their deception every day for 30 years. They've given up normal lives, friendships, freedom, the simple pleasure of being authentic. But so have all the people they've deceived. The neighbors who've worried about them, the family members who've restructured their lives to help, the insurance companies and donors who've given money thinking they were helping someone who needed it. Everyone has paid for their lie, whether they knew it or not." Tom was quiet for a moment, considering his wife's words. "But you're also thinking that destroying them now won't give those people back what they've lost. It won't undo the past 30 years or make the hurt disappear. It will just create a different kind of pain, a different set of losses. So you're trying to figure out if there's a way to honor both the truth and the complexity of the situation. That's who you are, Margaret. You've never been satisfied with simple answers when people's lives are complicated." Margaret turned from the window to look at her husband. "They want to try restorative justice, to come forward on their own terms and make restitution. But I'm not sure it's possible. The fraud is too big, too prolonged. I don't know if insurance companies and legal systems have room for that kind of process, or if they'll just insist on prosecution. And I don't know if Sarah and David are really strong enough to follow through. It's easy to talk about facing consequences when you're still protected by your secret. It's much harder when you're actually standing in front of people you've betrayed, accepting their anger and disgust." "So what are you going to do?" Tom asked. It was the question Margaret had been asking herself all night. Lying awake while Tom slept, wrestling with the moral weight of her knowledge and the responsibility it created. She had never asked for this burden, had never wanted to be the person who decided the fate of her neighbors. But here she was, holding their lives in her hands, her choices determining what happened next. It was a power she didn't want and a responsibility she couldn't escape. "I'm going to help them," Margaret said, surprised by her own certainty. "I'm going to help them find a way to tell the truth that does the least damage possible. Not because they deserve my help, and not because I approve of what they've done, but because I believe that people who are trying to escape from their mistakes deserve support. And because I think the path forward should be about repair rather than just punishment. It won't be easy and it might not even work, but it's the right thing to do. Or at least the most right thing I can think of in a situation where nothing is truly right." Tom pulled his wife close, kissing the top of her head. "Then I'll help too. Whatever you need, whatever they need to make this work, we'll figure it out together. Because that's what we do. We face hard things honestly, and we support people who are trying to do better even when they've done wrong. Especially when they've done wrong, because those are the people who most need others to believe they can change." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, grateful for this man who had been her partner through so many years, who understood her values even when they led her into complicated and difficult situations. The week between Christmas and New Year's was a blur of activity as Margaret worked with David and Sarah to develop a plan for their confession. They met daily at the Mitchell house, sometimes for hours, mapping out who needed to be told, what needed to be said, how restitution could be made. Margaret insisted they start with a lawyer, someone who could advise them on the legal implications and help structure their confession in a way that might minimize criminal consequences. David and Sarah were reluctant, afraid that a lawyer would simply tell them they were crazy to confess, but eventually they agreed. The lawyer they found, a woman named Rebecca Chen who specialized in white-collar crime, listened to their story with professional calm. When they finished, she sat back in her chair studying them for a long moment. "This is complicated," she finally said. "The fraud is extensive, and technically you could face serious charges. But the fact that you're coming forward voluntarily, that you're offering full restitution, and that so much time has passed, those factors work in your favor. I can't guarantee you won't face prosecution, but I can help you present your case in the best possible light. We'll need to approach the insurance companies first. Offer full repayment. Show genuine remorse and commitment to making things right." Rebecca laid out a strategy that would take months to implement. First, they would contact the insurance companies that had paid out claims over the years, offering to return the money with interest. They would document everything Sarah and David had received from various sources, including donations from friends and family. They would prepare a full accounting of their fraud, holding nothing back, demonstrating their commitment to transparency. Only after those preliminary steps would they begin the more personal work of confessing to family, friends, and neighbors, allowing those relationships to heal or end as the individuals involved decided. "You need to understand," Rebecca warned, "that this process will be excruciating. Even with your full cooperation and restitution, people will be angry. They'll feel betrayed, manipulated, foolish for having believed you. Some relationships will be permanently damaged. You may still face prosecution, though. I'll do everything I can to argue for alternative sentencing given the unique circumstances. And the publicity when this comes out will be intense. Your story will likely make news, and you'll be the subject of public judgment and speculation. You need to be prepared for all of that." Sarah reached for David's hand, and Margaret saw them draw strength from each other. These two people who had been bound together for 30 years by their shared secret were prepared, Sarah said, though her voice shook slightly. "Or at least, we're as prepared as we can be. We've been living in this prison for so long, and we're finally ready to be free. Whatever that costs. We just want to do this the right way, to hurt as few people as possible, to take responsibility for what we've done." Margaret watched them. These neighbors she'd thought she'd known. These complicated people who had made terrible choices and were now trying to make better ones. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From her accidental discovery through her obsessive investigation to this commitment to help them find redemption. She didn't know if what they were doing was right. Didn't know if forgiveness was possible for deception of this magnitude. But she knew that watching people take responsibility for their mistakes, watching them choose the hard path of honesty over the easy path of continued deception, restored something in her that had been damaged by the discovery of their fraud. "We'll get through this together," Margaret said, and she meant it. She had become invested in their story, committed to helping them navigate the impossible terrain ahead. It would change her life too, she realized. When their truth came out, when the neighborhood learned that she had known and helped them, she would face her own judgment and questions. But that was okay. Some things were worth the cost, and helping people find their way back to truth and authenticity was one of them, even when the path was difficult and the destination uncertain. January arrived with bitter cold, the warmth of the false spring replaced by the harsh reality of winter. Margaret spent her days coordinating the Mitchells' confession, becoming the project manager of their redemption. She maintained spreadsheets tracking their debts and restitution payments, scheduled meetings with lawyers and insurance representatives, and helped David and Sarah prepare for the difficult conversations ahead. It was exhausting work, both logistically and emotionally. But Margaret found it strangely fulfilling, as if she'd finally found a purpose that matched her skills and values. The insurance companies were the first hurdle, and to everyone's surprise, they were more receptive than expected. The fraud was old enough that prosecution would be difficult, and the offer of full repayment with interest was attractive compared to the cost of investigation and trial. One by one, settlements were reached, agreements signed, payments scheduled. David and Sarah would be financially devastated, forced to sell their house and most of their possessions to make restitution, but they would likely avoid criminal charges. It was a better outcome than anyone had dared hope for. Next came Sarah's sister, Jennifer, the holder of their mutual secrets and the original reason their silence had become permanent. Margaret insisted on being present for this conversation, held in Rebecca Chen's office with the lawyer serving as mediator. Jennifer arrived, looking terrified, clearly expecting the worst. And her face, when she saw Sarah walking into the room under her own power, was a study in shock and confusion. She had known Sarah could walk, but seeing it in public, outside the safe confines of their secret-keeping, made it real in a new and frightening way. "We're telling the truth," Sarah said without preamble. "About everything, about my fake disability, about the insurance fraud, about the 30 years of lies. And that means your secret comes out too, Jenny. The embezzlement, what you did to Mom and Dad's business, all of it. I'm sorry, but we can't be prisoners of each other anymore. We're all going to face the consequences of what we've done, together. And hopefully we can start rebuilding our lives from a foundation of truth instead of lies." Jennifer's reaction was explosive, tears and anger and denial pouring out in equal measure. She accused Sarah and David of betrayal, of breaking their agreement, of selfishly destroying her life to save their own. But Rebecca Chen calmly explained that Jennifer's crimes had also been included in their package of confessions, that they were seeking restorative justice for everyone involved, that Jennifer would have the same opportunity to make restitution and avoid prosecution if she cooperated. It took hours, but eventually Jennifer's anger gave way to exhausted acceptance, recognition that the deadlock that had trapped them all for years was finally breaking. "I've been waiting for this," Jennifer finally admitted, her voice hoarse from crying. "Living with what I did, with what I know about you, it's been hell. Every day I wake up afraid that today will be the day it all comes out, that I'll lose everything. At least now I know. At least now I can stop being afraid and start dealing with reality. I hate you both for making this choice without giving me a say, but I'm also grateful, because you're right. We couldn't keep living like this. None of us could." Margaret watched the three of them, seeing the weight of years lifting even as new burdens settled. The path ahead was still treacherous, filled with legal complexities and damaged relationships and public judgment. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer hiding, no longer pretending, no longer prisoners of their shared secrets. They were people who had done wrong and were taking responsibility, imperfect humans trying to find their way back to integrity. It wasn't redemption yet, might never be redemption, but it was movement in the right direction, and that counted for something. February brought the most difficult conversations, the ones Margaret had been dreading most, telling the neighbors, the friends, the community that had supported the Mitchells for 30 years. David and Sarah decided to approach people in small groups, starting with those closest to them and expanding outward. Margaret offered her house for these meetings, feeling it was important that they happen in a neutral space rather than in the Mitchell home where so much deception had occurred. She and Tom prepared for each gathering, setting out coffee and tissues, knowing that tears and anger would be inevitable. The first meeting included Linda Chen and 2 other longtime neighbors, people who had organized fundraisers and meal trains, who had given money and time and emotional support for years. Margaret watched as David and Sarah told their story, watching the faces of these kind people as understanding dawned, as shock gave way to betrayal, as the full magnitude of the deception became clear. Linda's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks, not for the Mitchells but for herself, for the fool she felt like, for the years of genuine concern that had been wasted on a lie. "How could you?" Linda asked, her voice breaking. "We loved you. We cared about you. Every time I cooked a meal for your family, every time I donated to your medical funds, I felt like I was doing something good, something meaningful. And it was all fake. You took our goodness and you exploited it for 30 years. How do you live with that? How do you look at yourselves in the mirror?" Her pain was raw and real, and Margaret felt it in her own chest, understanding that this was what justice looked like. This facing of consequences, this acceptance of others' hurt. David and Sarah didn't defend themselves, didn't offer excuses. They simply apologized, acknowledged the harm they'd caused, explained what they were doing to make restitution. They told their story honestly, including the accident, David's drunk driving, Sarah's recovery, their fear and shame, and the way small choices had snowballed into decades of deception. Some of it resonated, some of it didn't. Linda remained angry, unable or unwilling to find any sympathy for their situation. The other neighbors were more mixed, their reactions ranging from stunned silence to careful questions to outright disgust. "I don't know if I can forgive this." One neighbor finally said, "I want to believe that people can change, that they can make amends for their mistakes, but this isn't a mistake. This was a choice, made every single day for 30 years. Every time you saw us, every time you accepted our help, you chose to lie. That's not a momentary lapse of judgment. That's who you are, who you've been for your entire adult lives. How do we trust that you're different now? How do we know this isn't just another performance?" It was a fair question, one that Margaret herself had asked, and David and Sarah had no good answer. Trust, once broken on this scale, might never be fully restored. All they could offer was their commitment to truth going forward, their willingness to accept whatever consequences their honesty brought, their hope that over time, through actions rather than words, they might demonstrate genuine change. It wasn't much, and it wasn't satisfying, but it was all they had. The meeting ended with no resolution, no forgiveness, just a raw acknowledgement of harm done and uncertain paths forward. Over the following weeks, similar scenes played out with family members, other neighbors, and various people the Mitchells had deceived. Each conversation was painful, each revelation met with shock and anger and betrayal. Some people walked out, refusing to hear more, unwilling to even consider forgiveness. Others stayed, asked questions, struggled to reconcile the people they'd thought they knew with the reality of who David and Sarah actually were. A few, surprisingly, expressed something like understanding, recognition that people make terrible choices under pressure and then become trapped by them, unable to see a way out until someone or something forces change. The neighborhood divided as neighborhoods do when confronted with scandal. Some people sympathized with the Mitchells, seeing in their story a cautionary tale about how easy it is to get trapped by lies and how hard it is to escape. Others remained firmly opposed, believing that some betrayals were unforgivable, that 30 years of sustained deception couldn't be excused by explanations of fear and guilt. Margaret found herself in the middle, defending the Mitchells to some while acknowledging to others that their anger was justified. She had become their advocate whether she'd intended to or not. And it cost her some friendships, some standing in the community she'd been part of for 15 years. March brought the story to the local media as Rebecca Chen had predicted. A reporter got wind of the Mitchells' confessions and wrote a piece for the regional newspaper, and from there it spread to online platforms and eventually to national news outlets. The story had everything media loved: deception, betrayal. The question of whether redemption was possible after such sustained fraud. David and Sarah became briefly famous. their faces appearing on news segments. Their story debated on social media by people who knew nothing about them except the basic facts of their deception. The publicity was brutal. Online commenters were merciless, calling David and Sarah monsters, sociopaths, examples of everything wrong with modern society. Some focused on the insurance fraud, others on the betrayal of family and friends. Think pieces appeared analyzing what their story said about trust, truth, and the limits of forgiveness. David and Sarah had prepared themselves for judgment, but the scale and intensity of the public response was overwhelming, turning them into symbols rather than people. Their complicated reality reduced to clickbait headlines and hot takes. Margaret found herself thrust into the spotlight as well, the neighbor who had discovered the fraud but chosen to help rather than immediately expose it. Some people praised her compassion and her commitment to restorative justice. Others condemned her as an enabler, someone who had become complicit in the Mitchells' fraud by not immediately going to authorities. She gave several interviews trying to explain her reasoning, her belief that people deserved the chance to make amends, her conviction that punishment wasn't always the best response to wrongdoing. But nuance didn't translate well to sound bites, and she often felt misunderstood, her words twisted to fit narratives she didn't agree with. Through it all, the Mitchells persevered. They sold their house, the place that had been their prison and sanctuary for 30 years. They moved into a small apartment across town, starting over with almost nothing, their savings depleted by restitution payments. Sarah got a job at a local counseling center, ironically returning to the work she'd trained for before the accident. Using her experience with trauma and difficult truths to help others, David found work in a hardware store, physical labor that was humbling but honest, a far cry from the heroic caregiver identity he'd maintained for decades. Rebecca Chen had been right. They avoided prosecution. The combination of voluntary confession, full restitution, and passage of time convincing prosecutors that trial wasn't in the public interest, but the social consequences were severe. Most of their family relationships were permanently damaged, their siblings and extended relatives unable to forgive the scale of the deception. Old friends disappeared, unwilling to risk association with people who'd proven capable of such sustained lies. They were starting over in their late 50s, with few resources and even fewer connections, but they were starting over honestly. And that mattered to them in ways it hadn't before. Margaret continued to visit them in their new apartment, bringing meals as she once had, but now with full knowledge of who they really were. The conversations were different now, deeper, more real. They talked about who they'd been before the accident, the young couple with dreams and plans. They talked about the moment they'd realized they could fake Sarah's disability, and how tempting that path had seemed. Compared to facing David's guilt and the potential legal consequences, they talked about the creeping normalization of the lie. How something that started as a desperate, temporary measure became their permanent reality, year after year of small choices to maintain the fiction until they couldn't remember how to live any other way. "Do you regret telling the truth?" Margaret asked one evening, sitting in their spare apartment, so different from the comfortable house they'd lost. Given how hard it's been, the judgment, the publicity, losing almost everything you had, do you ever wish you'd just kept the secret? She watched their faces carefully, looking for honesty, hoping that after everything they'd been through, they'd learn to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable or reflected poorly on them. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret what we did," she finally said. "I regret the accident, David's drinking, the choice to fake my disability. Every year we maintained the lie. I regret the pain we caused and the people we hurt and the decades we wasted living half-lives. But telling the truth? No, I don't regret that. For the first time in 30 years, I can walk down the street without pretending, without performing, without calculating every movement to maintain the illusion. I can be myself, whatever that means after all this time. That freedom is worth everything we've lost." David nodded agreement, reaching for Sarah's hand in the gesture Margaret had seen countless times. Whatever else could be said about them, their bond was real, forged in shared trauma and sustained through decades of mutual deception. "The lie became heavier every year," he said. "At first it felt like penance, like I was paying for what I'd done by sacrificing my freedom to care for Sarah. But eventually I realized the lie itself was another crime, another way I was hurting everyone around me. Telling the truth hasn't made things easier, but it's made things possible. Now we can actually build a life instead of just maintaining a facade." Margaret thought about her own life, her 25-year marriage to Tom, the choices she'd made and the person she'd become. She'd always valued honesty, tried to live with integrity, but the Mitchells' story had shown her how complex those values could be in practice. Sometimes honesty meant destroying things to make room for truth. Sometimes integrity required causing pain to prevent greater harm, and sometimes the right choice wasn't obvious, wasn't clear, required living in uncertainty and doubt while trying to do the least damage possible. "I've learned from you," Margaret admitted. "Not the lesson you set out to teach, but something important anyway. I've learned that it's possible to forgive people while still holding them accountable, to have compassion for their struggles while acknowledging the harm they've caused. I've learned that truth matters, but so does how we pursue it, how we help people find their way back to it when they've lost their way. And I've learned that redemption isn't a destination, it's a process, one that might take the rest of your lives and still not feel complete." They sat together in comfortable silence, three people connected by accident and choice, by discovery and disclosure, by the complicated work of disentangling 30 years of lies. Outside, spring was beginning to assert itself, the March cold giving way to hints of warmth, trees budding with the promise of renewal. Margaret thought about cycles and seasons, about how things ended and began, about the possibility of growth after devastation. She didn't know what the future held for David and Sarah, didn't know if they would successfully rebuild their lives or remain forever marked by their past deception. But she knew they were trying, and she knew that trying mattered. She thought about the neighborhood they'd left behind, now forever changed by the revelation of the Mitchells' fraud. Some relationships had been destroyed, some had been strengthened, and some had been complicated in ways that might take years to sort out. The simple narrative of tragedy and devotion had been replaced by something messier, more real, less satisfying, but more honest. And maybe that was how healing worked. Not through tidy resolution, but through painful acceptance of reality in all its complexity. As Margaret prepared to leave, Sarah stopped her at the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not destroying us when you could have, for helping us find a way to tell the truth that preserved some possibility of moving forward. You didn't have to do that. You could have just exposed us and let the consequences fall where they would. The fact that you chose to help us make amends instead of just face punishment, that gift is something we'll never forget. We don't deserve your kindness, but we're grateful for it anyway." Margaret hugged Sarah. This woman who had been a stranger, then a mystery, then a complicated human being trying to find her way back to integrity. "We all make mistakes," Margaret said. "The question isn't whether we're perfect, but whether we're willing to face our imperfections honestly and try to do better. You're doing that now, and that takes more courage than maintaining the lie ever did. Keep going, keep being honest, keep trying to become people you can be proud of. That's all any of us can do." She left the apartment feeling both exhausted and strangely hopeful, carrying with her the weight of their story and the possibility of its eventual resolution. As spring fully arrived, Margaret found herself reflecting on the 4 months since she'd first seen that video of Sarah walking freely in her living room. It felt like years had passed, like she'd lived through some transformative experience that had fundamentally altered her understanding of truth, justice, and human nature. She'd learned that people were capable of sustaining elaborate deceptions while also being fundamentally good in other ways. She'd learned that accountability could coexist with compassion, that justice didn't always require punishment, and that the path to redemption was long and uncertain and often unsatisfying to everyone involved. The neighborhood was still divided, still processing what had happened, still trying to figure out how to relate to this new reality. Some people had forgiven the Mitchells, or at least moved toward forgiveness, recognizing the complexity of their situation and the courage it had taken to confess. Others remained angry, feeling that the betrayal was too great, the deception too sustained to ever be forgiven. Margaret understood both perspectives, saw validity in both responses, and refused to judge either camp for their choices. People processed betrayal differently, and there was no right answer to whether forgiveness was appropriate. What Margaret noticed, though, was that the neighborhood had become more real, less performative. People were more honest about their struggles, more willing to admit their imperfections, more cautious about judging others. The Mitchells' story had served as a kind of mirror, forcing everyone to examine their own lives, their own choices, their own capacity for deception and self-justification. It was uncomfortable work, but Margaret thought it was probably healthy, probably necessary for a community that had perhaps become too comfortable in its assumptions about itself. Tom had been her anchor through all of it, listening patiently as she processed her thoughts and feelings, offering perspective when she needed it, supporting her choices even when they complicated their own lives. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the neighborhood come alive with spring activities, he asked her if she had any regrets about getting involved, about choosing to help the Mitchells rather than simply exposing them. Margaret considered the question carefully, reviewing the past months, weighing the costs against the outcomes. "No," she finally said, "I don't regret it. It was hard, and it cost me some friendships, and it made my life more complicated than it needed to be. But I believe we did the right thing. We helped people take responsibility for their mistakes in a way that created possibility for growth rather than just punishment. We modeled a different approach to justice, one that prioritizes repair over retribution. And even if it didn't work out perfectly, even if the Mitchells struggle for the rest of their lives with the consequences of their choices, they're at least struggling honestly now. That matters. Tom smiled, pulling his wife close. You know what I love about you? After 50 years on this planet, you still believe that people can change, that redemption is possible, that the complicated work of helping people be better is worth doing. A lot of people lose that faith as they get older, become cynical or resigned. But you've kept it even after seeing how messy and difficult and often unsuccessful that work can be. That's rare, Margaret. That's special. His words brought tears to her eyes, recognition that she'd been seen and understood by the person who mattered most. As summer approached, Margaret heard that David and Sarah were doing well in their new life. They'd joined a support group for people working through shame and rebuilding their lives after major mistakes. They'd started attending a small church that emphasized grace and second chances. They were slowly, incrementally, building a community of people who knew their full story and chose to walk alongside them anyway. It wasn't the life they'd had before. Wasn't the comfortable existence of sympathy and support they'd maintained through their deception. But it was real and authentic and built on truth rather than lies, and that made it precious in ways their old life had never been. Margaret no longer watched the Mitchells' old house with the intensity she once had. New neighbors had moved in, a young family with children who brought energy and noise to the street. Life moved forward, as it always did, carrying the neighborhood into new chapters while the old stories faded into memory. But Margaret would never forget what she'd learned from her discovery of the Mitchells' secret. The journey from shock to understanding to complicated action, she'd learned that justice was more complex than she'd imagined. That truth was worth pursuing even when it was painful, and that people contained depths of both darkness and light that could surprise you if you looked carefully enough. These lessons would stay with her, shaping how she saw the world and how she moved through it, reminding her always that life was more complicated than any simple story could capture, and that was okay. A year after Margaret first saw the video that changed everything, she received an invitation in the mail. David and Sarah were having a small gathering to mark the anniversary of their confession, a quiet celebration of 1 year of living honestly. They were inviting the few people who had stood by them, who had helped them navigate the difficult path from deception to truth. Margaret showed the invitation to Tom, and without needing to discuss it, they both knew they would attend. Their involvement in the Mitchells' story had been too significant to step away now. Their commitment to seeing it through too deep to abandon at this point. The gathering was held in a park, neutral ground that carried no associations with either the Mitchells' old life or their new one. When Margaret and Tom arrived, they found about a dozen people there, a small group compared to the crowds of supporters the Mitchells had once claimed. Rebecca Chen was there, along with a few members of the support group. One of Sarah's cousins who had chosen forgiveness, and Linda Chen, who had been so angry at that first meeting but had gradually moved toward a complicated acceptance, if not quite forgiveness. David and Sarah looked different than they had a year ago. They appeared older, the stress of the past year visible in new lines on their faces, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. They moved with an ease that Margaret had only seen in those secret videos, without the constant performance of limitation, without the vigilance required to maintain a decades-long lie. When they welcomed Margaret and Tom, their gratitude was genuine, their smiles real, and Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction at having played a role in helping them find this freedom. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah said, when everyone had gathered. "A year ago today, we told the truth about who we really are, about what we'd done, about the life we'd been living in secret. It was the hardest thing we'd ever done, but it was also the most important. We've lost a lot this year: our home, our financial security, most of our relationships, our reputation, but we've gained something more valuable: authenticity. The ability to walk in the world as ourselves, without pretending, without hiding, without the constant fear of exposure. We're not asking for forgiveness from anyone here. We know we don't deserve it. But we wanted to mark this moment with the people who helped us get here, who showed us that truth was possible even when it seemed impossible." David spoke next, his voice steady but emotional. "I've spent this year learning who I am beyond the role of devoted caregiver. I played for 30 years. It's been disorienting, discovering that I'm not the person I pretended to be, but also not the person I was before the accident. I'm someone new, someone I'm still getting to know, someone shaped by mistakes and choices and the hard work of trying to make amends. It's uncomfortable, not having a clear identity, not being able to point to some heroic role and say that's who I am. But it's honest, and after 3 decades of dishonesty, that matters more than comfort." The gathering continued for several hours, people sharing their own stories of mistakes and redemption, of secrets kept and truths told, of the complicated work of being human in a world that often demands simplicity. Margaret listened more than she spoke, absorbing these stories, seeing how her own experience with the Mitchells fit into a larger pattern of human struggle and growth. She realized that in some way, their story had become her story too, that her choice to help them rather than expose them had become part of her own identity, part of how she understood herself and her values. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Rebecca Chen pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. "You know, the lawyer said what you did for David and Sarah, that wasn't typical. Most people, when they discover fraud, they report it and let the system handle things. You chose a different path, a harder path in some ways, taking responsibility for trying to guide them toward accountability rather than just punishment. That took courage, and it took wisdom. I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I've rarely seen restorative justice work as well as it has in this case. You should be proud of what you facilitated." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the recognition, not because she needed praise, but because Rebecca was acknowledging how difficult the past year had been, how much emotional labor had gone into helping the Mitchells navigate their confession and restitution. "I just did what felt right," Margaret said. "What felt most likely to create good from a bad situation. But there were so many times I doubted myself, wondered if I was enabling them, worried that I'd become complicit in their fraud by not immediately reporting it. I'm still not entirely sure I made the right choices." "That uncertainty is what makes me confident you did," Rebecca replied. "People who are certain they're right, who never question their choices, those are the people who do the most damage. You stayed humble, stayed open to feedback, stayed focused on repair rather than your own righteousness. That's rare and valuable, and exactly what the situation needed." She gave Margaret a hug before rejoining the group, leaving Margaret to process her words, to sit with the validation of someone who understood the complexity of what had been attempted and achieved over the past year. As Margaret and Tom drove home that evening, they talked about what they'd witnessed, the small community of people trying to support each other through the consequences of major mistakes. Tom pointed out that in some way, everyone there was working through their own version of the same challenge. How to live honestly after years of hiding some part of themselves. How to accept themselves with full knowledge of their flaws. How to believe that change was possible even when the past seemed to define them completely. The Mitchell story was extreme, but the underlying themes were universal, and that was why it had affected so many people so deeply. "Do you think they'll make it?" Tom asked as they pulled into their driveway. Looking across the street at the house where the Mitchells no longer lived, where a new family was writing their own story. "Long term, do you think David and Sarah will be able to sustain this honesty? To keep building a life based on truth rather than falling back into old patterns of deception?" It was a fair question, one Margaret had asked herself many times, and she didn't have a definitive answer. "I think they have a chance," Margaret said slowly. "I think they've done the hardest part, which is choosing truth when lying was easier, accepting consequences when avoidance was possible. But I also think it will be a daily choice for the rest of their lives, choosing honesty over convenience, choosing authenticity over protection. Some days they'll succeed, and some days they'll fail, because that's how human growth works. But the foundation is there now, and they have people supporting them, and they understand the cost of deception in ways they never did before. So yes, I think they have a chance. Maybe not certainty, but definitely a chance." They sat in the car for a few more minutes, neither quite ready to end the conversation, to return to their normal lives after the emotional intensity of the gathering. Margaret thought about her own journey over the past year, how much she'd learned about herself through her involvement with the Mitchells' story. She'd discovered reserves of compassion she hadn't known she possessed, alongside a commitment to accountability that sometimes felt at odds with that compassion. She'd learned to sit with uncertainty, to make decisions without complete information, to trust her moral instincts even when the path forward wasn't clear. "You know what strikes me most about all this?" Tom said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It's that everyone came out different than they went in. The Mitchells, obviously, but also you, me, the neighbors, everyone touched by this story. It forced all of us to think about truth and lies, about judgment and forgiveness, about who we are when we're not performing for others. In a weird way, their deception created an opportunity for the entire neighborhood to become more authentic, more honest about our own imperfections. I'm not saying the deception was good, but the response to it, the conversation it started, that had value." Margaret nodded, seeing the wisdom in Tom's observation. The neighborhood had changed, become less superficial, more willing to grapple with difficult questions. People were more real with each other now, more likely to admit struggles rather than maintaining perfect facades. The Mitchells' dramatic revelation had given everyone else permission to be more honest about their own lives, their own mistakes, their own fears of judgment. In that sense, truth had been contagious, spreading beyond the original confession to touch many lives, creating ripples of authenticity that were still spreading outward. They finally got out of the car and walked into their house, their home of 15 years that held its own history of choices and changes, of growth and adaptation. Margaret felt grateful for this life she'd built with Tom, for the solid foundation of honesty they'd always maintained, for the ways they'd learned to face difficulties together rather than hiding them from each other. The Mitchells' story had reinforced her appreciation for what she had, made her value the integrity of her relationship in new ways. She would never take for granted the freedom to be herself, to live without secrets, to walk through the world without constantly performing or hiding. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she stood at her bedroom window looking out at the quiet neighborhood. In the past year, this view had meant so many different things. The place where she'd discovered a secret, where she'd wrestled with moral dilemmas, where she'd witnessed transformation and pain and the slow, difficult work of people trying to become better versions of themselves. Tomorrow, it would just be a neighborhood again, her neighbors living their lives, some aware of the drama that had unfolded, and some oblivious to it. But Margaret would always see it differently now. Always remember what she'd learned from the people across the street who had lived a lie for 30 years before finally choosing truth. She didn't know what the future held for any of them, but she knew they were facing it honestly now, and that made all the difference. With that thought, she turned from the window and went to bed, ready for whatever came next, confident in her ability to face it with the same commitment to honesty and compassion that had guided her through the past extraordinary year.